So I'm Eric Hutchinson. I am with the Division of Veterinary Resources at the NIH. I am in charge of the behavior program there. I'm here today to talk to you about swine and their ethology and their cognitive well-being considerations in the laboratory. This is the confessional part, is that I am actually a primate-centered person. So this was an article that came out about a year ago that was about an outbreak at a primate facility. And I don't bring it up to pinpoint the facility or the outbreak. It's just something that I was reading in the newspaper and then got to this paragraph about 4 monkey-like rhesus macaques. So I think that's an appropriate way to think about me talking about swine behavior. So I'm a swine behaviorist-like veterinarian. So I'm certainly not an expert, but I have plenty of experience working with swine and being in charge of their behavior, even if I don't necessarily understand what they're doing. I thought that I could go ahead and talk and we could get a conversation going. So when I found out I was going to try and give this talk, I was explaining to my 8-year-old daughter that I had to give this talk, and she said, well, how hard could this be? There's only 5 things you need to know about pigs. Oh, really? What are those things? Well, pigs are smelly. Pigs are pink, but they can also be black and white. Pigs like playing in the mud, and pigs don't have manners. And I thought, this is a terrific way to organize my talk. So this is how we're going to do it. Pigs are smelly. So pigs are, their natural behavior out in the wild is that they are the wild boar of Eurasia. And the reason that pigs are so great is that they are ultimately adaptable. They're like the rhesus or the humans in terms of being a weed species. They're very intelligent. They can adapt almost anywhere. What's really important to note is that their prominent feature is this giant snout. So pigs are smelly, right? So they can smell very, very well. It's basically a snout machine. Like it's a snout with the rest of an animal attached to it in terms of behavior. So that snout is very integral to pigness, to being a pig. So they have this terrific sense of smell. That's how they hunt down. They don't do hunting out in the wild, but they do hunt down all sorts of roots and vegetables, fallen nuts and fruits. They use that snout, it's powered by those powerful neck muscles behind it. So they use that snout as both a bulldozer. They can dig through completely frozen ground in Siberia, looking for fallen pine cones and nuts. They dig their own burrows through frozen ground, and they can also use it as a hand trowel. So they can be very sensitive with that snout. So they're not just all force digging and digging and digging. Once they get close to something that they're trying to find, they'll slow down and be very delicate. I like to say that pigs practice extreme omnivory. So much like us, they will find and adapt to eating almost anything that you can get calories out of. So pigs are very good at eating whatever they find, and they're very good at finding whatever they can eat. So their social structure is pretty similar to macaques, actually. So they have stable matrilineal groups. So they will have moms and aunts and sisters and daughters that stay in a group with male emigration at puberty. So as the males get to where they're going to be sexually mature, they get kicked out. And that's where they become nature's natural best. So males develop these huge tusks. During breeding season, they undergo a change to their subcutaneous tissue in their back, where it's essentially like growing a set of armor for a few months. They can grow up to 600 pounds. They actually produce natural anti-venom, so natural anti-snake venom. So even if you are a predator and manage to capture a male pig, just to spite you, they've made themselves taste terrible. So they have what's called boar taint, where boars don't taste good. So pigs are designed to be this armored creature, and especially the male boars. And I think that that's something that John Bradfield kind of hinted at yesterday, that maybe this thing that's designed with weapons and a shield isn't the best thing to put together socially, especially when this is all designed around the mating behavior and breeding season. So adult male intact boars may not be the best social candidates, but that is not to mean that the rest of pigdom is not terrific at being social. So let's remember, these are an animal that's designed with a low center of gravity, armor at the front, or armor on the back, weapons at the front, just a few other things that are designed that way in nature. So let's remember that basically nature had to invent the tiger because it seemed silly to have bacon at the top of the food chain in Russia. So the next thing that my daughter said was pigs are pink. Well, in the wild, they aren't really pink. So how did we get from this, what I would say on the left, that's probably the most majestic picture you will ever see of a pig, right? Leaping through the air like a gazelle, hair streaming behind it. And then we have our tiny little bags of bacon that we've bred. So how did we get there? So we domesticated pigs about 13,000 years ago. That's a long time. Through breeding and traditional husbandry practices, we have adapted them for indoor life and cohabitation with people. Now, some of those are not necessarily breeding. Some of that is just practices like tusk trimming, tail docking, and castration are very traditional practices, or are traditional in the last 50 years or so, practices that were designed to allow pigs to be held in maximum density in production facilities. So a lot of our pigs that we get into research facilities still have these things going on. So they've had their tusks trimmed. A lot of the males that we get are castrated unless you're specifically seeking out intact boars, and a lot of them have had their tails docked. But pigs can also be black and white. So we started with these domesticated market pigs, and we in research have bred them further to facilitate our model development. And each breed has been selected basically for physical or physiological characteristics, but we have to remember that when we do stuff like that, a lot of times behavior goes along for the ride. So just like C57 Black 6s, were selected for lots of characteristics that have very little to being jerks when they're males, but ended up that way anyway. This is how we can end up with certain behavioral characteristics of some of our pig breeds. So the Yorkshire is probably the most common market breed that's used for research. That's the classic pink pig that you think of. Their number one characteristic that I would say is important for research is that if you keep them around for very long, they get very, very big. And so the risk reward for having a pig that's cooperative and is used to handling becomes very high for Yorkshire breeds. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of my talk. But I think if you're going to use Yorkshires, you definitely have to be aware that they will get very big very fast. Yucatans are another breed that's used a lot in biobehavioral research and biomedical research. So they are a very docile breed, so they're pretty easy to get along with. I find them very easy to work with, but they definitely have a face that only a mother could love. Gottingen mini pigs are a special little breed. So they are bred to stay small basically their whole lives, remain manageable the whole lives. But one problem that they present, especially when socializing, is they tend to be what I'll call libidinous. So there will be several Gottingen mini pigs in a group, and one will decide that he's going to mount every single other Gottingen mini pig at all times, always. And so that's an issue that you have to manage somewhat actively to make sure that you're not causing more stress with the socialization. And then there are Sinclair mini pigs. This is just another example. These guys, when I've worked with these guys, I found them to be what I would consider flighty. So I think it was actually Karen that was saying yesterday, that was the word that she said. And I was like, yeah, that's about how I would describe that, how they act. They're not necessarily the most friendly of the pigs, or they're a little skittish, basically. So my daughter also said that pigs like playing in the mud, and indeed they do. So we should remember that we should allow fulfillment of these basic behavioral drives that pigs have and all these other animals have. That's what this conference is all about, is we need to maintain the ability to model these animals' environment, like John said, so that they can be the best models that we can use for our research. So one thing that pigs are definitely driven to do is rooting. So they can root up or root down. So what I mean by that is if you have the ability to spread forage out in bedding, that's probably the best thing you can do for a pig from an enrichment standpoint. They'll go searching for very tiny treats in very large amounts of bedding, and it takes up a lot of time. It fills up their natural activity budget, but I know that that's not always possible. So another thing you can do is you can talk to your local toy vendor and get a ball that's designed primarily for primates, these challenger balls, and you can put things in these challenger balls and hang it just above snout height so that the pigs then have to do this to root up at the ball and get things out of it. You can also make these so that the holes are only in the top so that they have to actually be able to invert the ball to get them out, and they'll be pretty motivated to get them. So you can allow for that behavior even if you're not going to be able to use bedding. But I do encourage use of bedding if you can get away with it. The other thing that's important for housing pigs is allowing them the chance to explore and giving them cognitive challenge if there's any way to do that. One of the things that I'm going to talk to you about is positive reinforcement training is a great way to give pigs a cognitive challenge. Candace Croney and others have also done a lot of work challenging pigs with mazes and memory tasks, and basically found that they are these supremely intelligent creatures. They're, depending on the popular source that you want to use, they are theoretically the fourth most intelligent animal that we have tested, ahead of dogs. So it's a good thing that Dr. Burns already left before I said that. But the other thing about pigs is that they like playing with social partners. So pigs, again, are very social, again, with that tiny caveat of intact male boars. But again, intact boars are not the most common thing in research facilities. So most of the pigs that you will work with are a very social species. They should be given the chance to be social with other conspecifics. And the other thing you should be aware of, that if you deny them this chance to engage in their normal behaviors, just like any other animal out there, you should expect that they're going to develop some abnormal behaviors. Now in pigs, that tends to manifest as cage chewing or destruction of cages or whatever toys you've put in there. It can also manifest as aggression toward other pigs or toward handlers and humans. And then they will develop locomotor stereotypies just like most of our other animals if they aren't given the opportunity to express their normal behaviors. So again, we heard yesterday from ALAC, from USDA, and OLAW that social species should be housed socially as a default. And I just want to say that it was interesting listening to John talk about how some ACUCs just hadn't considered some of these things before the recent edition of the guide came out, because I was at a facility that just hadn't considered social housing pigs, and it wasn't the guide that convinced us to do it. It was actually that we had an early morning project with pigs, and we hadn't really had one of those before. So we were coming in as the pigs were waking up, and we kept finding these pigs that were housed in kennels next to each other with cyclone fencing, laying next to each other. So you would never find a pig laying on a side without another pig next to it. So they were always paired up. And so it was just one of those things. It was like a light bulb went off in our attending veterinarian's mind. It was like, well, this is silly. We should be housing these guys together. So we pulled out those sections of cyclone fencing, and suddenly we had socialized pigs. And of course, everything went great. But it doesn't always go great. So social introductions and housing pose a similar variety and types of challenges as for primates. So there are certain types of pigs that are easy to socialize, certain types of pigs that are harder to socialize. Younger animals and litter mates are the ideal social partners. So younger animals are more tolerant of others. They're more into play behavior and exploration. And obviously litter mates, if you can get them and have them identified as litter mates, they're easier to socialize because they're already familiar with those animals. The other thing to remember is that different breeds do have different social tendencies. And again, like I talked about with the Göttingen mini pigs, they have this persistent mounting issue. So a bit of a how-to, and this isn't really, I wouldn't say that this is prescriptive in that everybody should be doing it exactly this way. This is just how we do it at the NIH, and we do socialize a lot of pigs at the NIH. We don't have the ability for protected contact, but again, if you have kennels that are separated by cyclone fencing, you can put pigs next to each other and basically allow them to explore each other through the cyclone fencing and do the slow introduction system like you would with primates. But if you don't have that, it's still okay to go ahead and try just socializing with immediate full contact. Obviously, you want to monitor that as you initially socialize them. You do need to watch them and make sure they're engaging in normal exploratory behaviors, not doing the persistent mounting thing, not fighting. When we can, we do introduce pigs in an expanded and neutral area. So this is actually a picture of that here, where we're socializing pigs in this hallway outside of their kennel. We have an enclosed hallway right outside the kennel, and that's where we do our introductions. So we basically release both pigs out of their single cage out into this hallway, and they get a chance to familiarize themselves with each other there. And the main advantage of that is that if the one pig wants to escape, there's room to do so. So that is the problem with doing it in the normal sized enclosure, doing a pair in a normal sized enclosure. If they decide they're going to fight, it becomes this pig circle where one is trying to escape and they don't have anywhere to go. And then you end up having to intervene, which puts your staff in danger. The other thing that we try and do is, if we have space for it, if we can, we do groups. Groups are advantageous for a lot of reasons, but the main one is they give you a lot more flexibility as pigs are used for study, or if one doesn't get along with the others, you can maybe pull out a pair rather than just separating one all by itself. So if we can, we do groups. The other thing to remember is that they do require follow-up. So just like any other animal that you're socializing, doing social introductions for the first time, you need to remember to go back and actually check how they're doing later. So food aggression is pretty common in pigs, and so you need to make sure that everybody's getting sufficient access to food at feeding times. The good news is that pigs eat very quickly, so if you do have to separate for feeding, it doesn't take very long. The other thing to look for is wounds on the ears and tail. So sometimes those can be kind of subtle. There isn't necessarily going to be blood everywhere. Obviously, it's pretty obvious when you come in and there's blood all over the cage that something went poorly. But you do want to look for bites on the ears and bites on the tail. And then watch for scratches along the back. Those are usually pretty obvious, but remember that those don't always actually mean fighting. A lot of times scratches on the back are indicative of mounting, which is part of a normal dominance hierarchy establishment. So troubleshooting. So for specific pairs, again, this mounting issue is something that a lot of people have asked about, and again, it's very common with Göttingen mini pigs. It does tend to reduce over time as the pigs figure out a dominance hierarchy. The problem is if it's happening so much that you can't tolerate it, you won't necessarily be able to give the group or the pair long enough to figure that out. So you kind of have to decide for yourself and for your facility how much of this mounting behavior you're going to tolerate before you separate a pair or separate a pig away from a group. For food aggression, it's like I said, it's pretty easy to separate pigs for feeding, and it usually doesn't take very long, so it's not a huge time sink. You can also install or utilize blinds, so if you have cages that are set up where there's a solid wall in the back and an opening at the front, usually just feeding them in back is sufficient to stop that feeding aggression. You can also pair chronic mounting animals with larger animals. So if you socialized a group of 5 and one animal's decided that it's going to mount everybody in that group, you can pull that one out. And if you have an older animal around, the good news about pigs, they get bigger as they get older very quickly. And so you don't have to find an animal that's much more than a month older, and they'll be significantly larger than the newer counterpart. And if you put that mounting animal with a larger animal, so we've found that it sometimes helps establish this dominance hierarchy. More programmatic troubleshooting. So if you're finding that a lot of your pairs are breaking down or a lot of your groups are breaking down, some of the things you can do to address that is to actually request litter mates or documentation of who the animals have been with from your vendor. And a lot of vendors obviously don't send that along, but a lot of pigs that you're sent, if you're ordering 4 pigs, they'll often be litter mates just by accident or by convenience of the vendor. But you may not know that unless you ask the question. So you might be getting great social partners and just by random chance pairing them with somebody who's not a great social partner. So it's worth asking the question of your vendors. The other thing to remember is that groups allow more flexibility. Also be aware of shipping stress. So if you do a pair on the first day that pigs show up and it doesn't work out, that doesn't mean that those pigs are jerks and that they can never be socialized. Obviously a lot of stuff happens during shipping that is stressful to pigs. That's why there's such a thing as shipping fever. It's not an innocuous thing to get transferred to a new facility. And so throwing them to a new facility and then trying to pairing them on that same day, although it a lot of times works, when it doesn't work, it doesn't necessarily reflect on the individual pig as being unpairable. The other thing is that pigs have been shown to engage in cooperation, and there's some evidence that they show empathy, which is a pretty big deal in the animal cognition world. Obviously, as you would guess, that's controversial. One idea that you might consider is giving pigs the opportunity to cooperate or work together on a task, or just put them in a foraging area so they can spend some time foraging together where they're both occupied and just kind of occupying the same space. That might help with introductions. All right, so now for pigs don't have manners. That was all of the socialization. Obviously, I think the best way to exchange information on pig socialization is during the breakout sessions. If you have questions, we can talk among people that have ideas. Pigs can learn. So pigs are very intelligent. They're very amenable to training because they're very intelligent, but also because they are extremely food motivated. That's a good training subject, is an animal that's definitely food motivated and can figure out what you're asking of it. Also be aware that training pigs has high reward, especially for these larger breeds. Again, if you're dealing with Yorkshires and find out that you're going to have to keep them in your facility more than a couple months, you should be prepared to have a very large Yorkshire that won't necessarily cooperate with you unless you are active about making sure that it will. So training animals can facilitate husbandry, medicine, and research. And again, I'm going to try and convince you that it's not very hard. So the kind of classic approach for handling pigs has been the Panapinto sling, and this is probably the best known method. And this is very effective where prolonged restraint is necessary. So there are lots of protocols where pigs have to be held still for, on the order of an hour or more. And in those cases, the Panapinto sling is probably still the best option. It can be used with large pigs that you haven't had the chance to train necessarily before. So in a lot of cases, this will still be the best option. But do be aware that it can be stressful if you haven't sensitized the animals to it. So you have to get the animal to the sling. You have to get the sling cranks up and makes loud noise as you're lifting the animals up. And then obviously they're being lifted into the air, which isn't a natural thing for them. So do be aware that that's not totally innocuous. But you can also engage in a few pretty simple things to make handling pigs a lot easier later in life. And early and positive human contact is one of the easiest things you can implement in your facility that will reap big benefits. So this is just an example. This is a brand new pig that has never been handled before. And this is an example of two things. So this is an example how it's a pain in the butt to try and handle a brand new pig. But also this is an example of the kind of handling that we do for pigs just to get them used to it. So she's just putting her hand on them, basically trying to do a run through a fake physical exam. As you would guess, the pig is not very tolerant of it, but very motivated by shoelaces. So this is the much older version. So remember that tiny little pig doing all of that. If you got to this size and then that pig acted like that, it would be very difficult, right? So this is a pig. Oh, that was not a pig. Okay. This is a pig that has had some training. So he's going to flip his ears a little bit because he doesn't like playing with his ears. But she's able to basically run through a hands-on exam while this pig is just standing there. And if this pig didn't want to stand still for a hands-on exam, he would not have to. He's plenty big that he could push her around if she wanted to. So obviously that's not very complicated. That's just handling, getting them used to handling. That's not something that takes a PhD exactly. So target training is another simple training task that's, I would say, slightly more advanced, but at least you're getting into the positive reinforcement training here. But target training facilitates so many other things, facilitates so many other tasks and behaviors that can be useful. So I have sped this video up considerably so that you can see the entire training process of target training a pig. Target, treat. You can see that this isn't like 20 times speed, right? Target, treat. And then she just lays the target down and he knows that he's supposed to go there to get the treat. So that was 3 trial learning, everybody. That was a pig that had arrived that day and had just been let out of the pen. So obviously we got lucky with our subject. They aren't all that easy, but man, did I get lucky with my subject. So that was 3 trial learning on using a target, going to a target. And then once you have that target trained, you can obviously use that to do a lot of other things. So you can facilitate medical exams, you can facilitate transfer to another area, and this is an example of that. So again, this is that same pig. This is exactly 45 seconds after we have ever let that pig out of its pen in our facility. Oh. And she's targeting him down to a scale. So she has to, that's a little scary. She has to raise that door, and then she puts him in the scale. So now we've weighed our pig. Again, this is a minute after we've let this pig out of the pen for the very first time in our facility. So that's pretty cool, right? I mean, that's pretty nice. I wish my monkeys would train behaviors like that. So you can also train pigs to cooperate with a lot of more complicated procedures. So we actually had an investigator that we had pigs that were compromised cardiovascularly. And so we were having to do a lot of procedures that were requiring sedation post cardiovascular compromise, where that sedation is a danger to the experiment, danger to the pig, because they're already cardiovascular compromised. So we're having to sedate them to do things like remove sutures. We're having to sedate them to do things like drain an abscess. We're having to sedate them to do things like apply ointment even, like simple stuff like that. And so sedations for each of those things, each time that's a danger. And so we're taking a risk with this experiment, with this pig, that we can get around with positive reinforcement training. So I'm going to walk you through step by step this super complicated procedure whereby we got pigs to hold still for suture removal. So this is Ashley, who's our trainer. So first she's holding a treat in front of the pig. And I would like you to notice that this pig is being socialized while it's in the training procedure. So we don't necessarily have to separate the pigs out. I can't argue that the other pig is doing any observational learning right now. But so she's holding a treat there. She raises it over his nose and then pushes back. You've probably never seen this behavior before, right? We like to call it pork butt recumbency. So she's just dog sitting this pig. So this is a pretty easy procedure to do. But once the pig is trained to sit, and you can reward it to sit and get it to sit on command, sit is a behavior that's exclusive to wiggle around or run around the cage. So if you can get them to sit consistently, you can do a lot of stuff. So this is actually a gastric tube that's passed into this pig to deliver a medication while its leg is being examined, which is the area where they're going to have sutures that have to be removed from this pig. So again, this pig has only been here for a few days, and we've got it trained to do this because we don't have a whole ton of time between when the animals arrive and when the procedure starts. So in a few sessions a day and a few days, we're able to get these pigs to hold pretty still. And then eventually you can do it with it's just one person. So again, anybody that's done animal training knows that they can do incredible things with animal training, but pigs are just as capable of anything else to learn how to do these procedures, and it's not all that hard. So in summary, pigs are smelly. No. Okay, so evolution and our domestication and breeding have shaped pigs and their behavior in ways that should be acknowledged in captivity. So we have to remember that the pig in our facility is driven by all the things that the pig out in the wild is driven by, but that we've mucked about a little bit and caused a few other little nuances. They should be given the opportunity to explore, forage, and root. Those are basic behaviors for a pig. It's just like a monkey needing time to search for its food or time to process its food with a foraging board or whatever. Pigs need that opportunity as well. Pigs are social and should be socialized, and this requires effort, just like for any other species, but it's worth it. So you're giving the pigs maximum benefit with a social partner. Also, they're intelligent. They can be easily trained to cooperate in husbandry, veterinary, and experimental procedures, and I hope that those videos have helped convince you that it's worth the minimum investment of time. So obviously, I have lots of acknowledgments. My DVR behavior team is, every time in this talk that I said I or we, what I really meant is they. So they are the ones that do all this training, and they're the ones that do all the pig socialization, so I owe all this to them. And then I used a number of photos from Michelle Eckstein, who's another DVR person. So thank you guys.